The gravity blade. The work order was supposed to be simple. That's what they all are in the beginning. Marcus Hayes had learned not to expect complications. In 7 years of maintaining the deep systems aboard Station Kepler 9, he'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of small fixes and smaller consequences. Gravity fluctuations, power redistribution, a busted environmental regulator in some forgotten corner of the station. Work in, work out. Lunch at noon. Home by 1800. The machinery of survival kept turning by the invisible hands of people like him. He wasn't supposed to notice the weight of his insignificance. Most maintenance techs didn't. This was the real architecture of existence aboard Kepler 9, not the fusion reactors or the environmental systems, but the elaborate structure of not mattering. You learned early that noticing your own invisibility was the fastest way to resent it, so you didn't notice. You performed your job with competence, collected your credits, and accepted that your name would never appear in any official commendation. This wasn't bitterness. It was simply how things worked. The cosmos required maintenance, and the universe didn't care who provided it. Marcus had made peace with this, or at least he'd learned to live alongside it, the way you learn to live with a constant sound you eventually stop hearing. He was good at his work, meticulous, careful, thorough, and these qualities made him reliable and, by extension, forgettable. People remembered the technicians who broke things or the ones who complained, the ones who just fixed what needed fixing. They faded into the background like dust settling on a shelf. They became part of the station's infrastructure, no more worthy of attention than the power conduits or the water recyclers they serviced. He was 34 years old. He'd never been married, had a sister on Europa who sent messages twice a year, brief, polite exchanges that suggested she'd moved on with her life and expected him to do the same. No children. No ambitions beyond the next shift and the one after that. His quarters were small, standard crew accommodation, nothing personal beyond a few books and a hollow display that cycled through nature scenes from Earth, a planet he'd never visited and probably never would. The forests in those scenes were impossibly green, the oceans impossibly blue. They represented a world he'd only ever know as abstraction. His life was a series of ordered tasks, each one completed and filed away before the next arrived. This had seemed sufficient to him, up until the moment it suddenly wasn't. The work order came through at 5:30 hours on a Tuesday morning, flagged priority low. Vault 7. Gravity fluctuation. Investigate and repair. Marcus had been sipping cold coffee in the maintenance break room when it pinged his data pad, and he'd barely looked up. He finished the coffee, burned, slightly metallic, tasting faintly of recycled molecules and regret, grabbed his toolkit and headed toward the lower decks. On the way, he stopped at the galley and picked up a breakfast burrito wrapped in silver foil. The filling was some synthetic protein mix that tasted vaguely like chicken and desperation, but it was hot, and that was enough. The vault doors were already open. Night shift, he assumed. They'd probably left it unlocked by accident, or maybe it was scheduled maintenance. Either way, it saved him from having to override the security protocols. Marcus stepped inside and immediately felt it, that subtle wrongness in the gravity field, like walking through water that wasn't quite water. His inner ear registered the inconsistency before his conscious mind could articulate it. Every step felt slightly too light, then slightly too heavy, as though the station itself was inhaling and exhaling beneath his feet. The hexagonal chamber opened before him, and Marcus stopped. This wasn't what he'd expected. The vault wasn't some forgotten storage closet. It was theater, a cathedral of strange purpose. The walls curved in toward a central point, their surfaces embedded with technology Marcus didn't recognize. Not human, he knew that much. The pedestal arrangement suggested intention beyond mere weapon storage. Each pillar was carved from something that caught the light and held it, amber-colored and smooth, its surface marked with symbols that shifted subtly in the peripheral vision, as though refusing to be fully perceived. And in the center, suspended in midair about 3 feet above its base, was a sword. Not a display piece, a weapon, an artifact. It spun slowly, almost ceremonially, turning in increments so precise they seemed almost deliberate. The blade itself was dark, not black, but the kind of darkness that suggested depth, like looking into water at night. The hilt caught what little light existed in the vault and threw it back with an urgency that made Marcus uneasy. It hung there like something alive, like something waiting. He pulled his scanner from his toolkit and began taking readings. The gravity flux was obvious, oscillating between 0.8 and 1.4 Gs with no pattern he could immediately discern. The source was unmistakable, though. That sword. The containment field around it was working overtime, correcting against gravity forces that shouldn't have been possible in a standard field generator. Marcus crouched by the pedestal controls, pushing the breakfast burrito aside on the floor, and started examining the hardware. The panel had been modified recently. He could tell by the dust patterns around the circuit boards, the slight discoloration from recent tool marks. Someone had been in here, attempted something, and left without finishing the job. The regulator was all wrong. Marcus traced through the schematics in his mind, Type 7 graviton regulator instead of a Type 9. For anything over 50,000 kilograms, a Type 7 was like using a household circuit breaker for an industrial facility. The strain on the system would cause exactly what he was seeing: erratic fluctuations, as the regulator tried to compensate for forces it wasn't designed to handle. That's when he sensed the presence behind him. Human. The voice was wet, layered with something that sounded like wind moving through water. Step away from the gravity blade. Marcus turned slowly. He'd seen Calaxians around the station before. They were integrated into the crew, mostly upper command or technical specialists. But this one was different. Loxo, if his memory was right, one of the security officers. He was tall, 7 feet at least, with skin that held a muted blue-green luminescence, like bioluminescence operating at half capacity. 3 eyes, 2 forward-facing, intelligent and narrow with a horizontal pupil, and a third mounted on the crown of his head, currently rotating in slow circles that suggested he was scanning the entire vault simultaneously. The gravity locks busted, Marcus said, already turning back to the control panel. Just give me a second. I'll have it stabilized before you need to file any reports. The lock is not malfunctioning. Loxo's skin flickered, orange patches spreading across his forearms like a warning light bleeding through blue cloth. It is set to maximum security. The blade cannot be contained through normal means. You must step back. You do not understand what you are. Marcus didn't respond. He was too focused on the hardware. This was his domain, the place where uncertainty became simple mechanics. He traced the power line to its source, found the regulator panel, and immediately saw the problem with such clarity it felt almost like relief. Someone had either been negligent or had no idea what they were doing. Installing the wrong regulator for a task like this suggested either incompetence or deliberate sabotage. Neither possibility was good. You must not adjust the controls, Loxo said more urgently now, his skin beginning to shift toward a deeper orange. Please, I am asking you. But Marcus had already found the replacement in his toolkit. He always carried spares, always. In 7 years, he'd learned that most problems weren't complicated. They were just overlooked. The regulator swap took 40 seconds. When he twisted the final connector into place, the pedestal emitted a soft beep, and the sword stabilized. The gravity fluctuations in the room smoothed out instantly. Marcus felt it in his inner ear, felt the station settle back into its expected 1G rhythm like a held breath finally released. There we go, he said, standing up and brushing dust from his maintenance jumpsuit. Easy fix. Type 7 regulator doesn't have the headroom for something this heavy. Whoever set this up didn't think it through, or they were in a hurry. Either way, you're good now. He reached for the sword without thinking about it. Just a simple action. Grab the hilt, check if the pedestal was damaged underneath, make sure nothing else needed repair. His fingers wrapped around the handle. It was warm, almost hot, surprisingly warm, in fact, as though it had been holding heat against the containment field. And it was heavy. Not the weight Loxo had been warning about, just normal heavy, like lifting a full toolbox with one hand, maybe 35 pounds. Awkward weight distribution, sure, but nothing that challenged him. Nothing that required more than the casual strength of someone who'd spent 7 years handling equipment and mechanical systems. Marcus lifted it off its stand, checking the pedestal beneath. A light scorch mark, minor, nothing serious. And then he looked up to find Loxo completely frozen, all 3 eyes locked onto the blade in his hand. The Calaxian's skin had shifted to a deep, emergency red. His throat sac, a membrane beneath his jaw that served some combination of respiratory and communicative function, inflated to the size of a grapefruit, and the sound that came from him was something between a scream and the noise of air escaping a balloon. The effect was disturbing in a way that made Marcus very aware he'd done something wrong. "It should be impossible," Loxo wheezed, his webbed fingers gripping the edge of the nearest pedestal so hard they'd gone pale green, the blood draining from the tissue with the force of his grip. "You should be crushed. Your bones should be powder. Are you okay, dude? You're like really red right now, and you're leaking everywhere. Should I call medical?" Marcus turned the blade over in his hand, checking the grip, feeling how it sat in his palm. The weight distribution was weird, he had to admit, off-center, but manageable in the way that anything becomes manageable once you understand its physical properties. "Look, the pedestal's fine, just needed the regulator swapped. It's all stabilized now. You seem to be in distress, though. Seriously, should I call someone?" Loxo managed to prop himself up against one of the other pedestals, leaving a trail of slime behind him that Marcus decided not to think too hard about. "How are you holding it?" the Calaxian asked, his voice barely above a whisper, each word seeming to cost him something. "How is this possible? This is not possible." "With my hand," Marcus said, suddenly uncertain why he was being so casual about this. "Look, weight distribution's weird, but it's not that bad." He tossed it up a few inches, just a small gesture, testing the balance, a gesture he'd done 1,000 times with equipment and tools. He caught it again with the same ease, the same reflexive confidence that came from 7 years of handling objects in microgravity and variable gravity environments. The toss broke something in Loxo's ability to process what was happening. His eyes went in 3 different directions simultaneously, his pupil dilating then contracting in patterns that suggested neurological distress. "Our strongest warriors cannot lift it from the ground," he said, speaking very slowly, as though each word was a tremendous effort. "The last soldier who attempted to wield it had both arms torn from their sockets by the gravitational stress. The injuries were catastrophic. Before that, 3 warriors were crushed when they tried to move it in tandem, crushed by their own inability to control the force. We require industrial anti-grav sleds just to transport it between stations. Even then, we lose equipment to the gravitational shear, and you are tossing it, like a toy, like a child's plaything." Marcus looked down at the sword, then back at Loxo, then down at the sword again. The reality of what he was hearing pressed against his understanding like something trying to force its way into a locked room. If what Loxo was saying was true, if this sword really was as dangerous as he claimed, then what he'd just done shouldn't have been possible. "It's just heavy," Marcus said, but he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice now. "I mean, it's awkward, but it's not crushing me or anything. I'm fine." "You are holding the most dangerous weapon in Calaxian history," Loxo whispered. Before Marcus could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the lower decks. Not urgent alarms, status alarms, red light cascading across the vault walls in rhythmic waves, and then, through the open door, came the sound of rapid footsteps echoing down the corridor. Commander Snow arrived like a force of nature condensed into the shape of a Calaxian woman. She was older than Loxo, sharper, her skin A steely blue-gray that suggested discipline had been written into her biology at some fundamental level. Her three eyes were different too, colder, more calculating, the eyes of someone who'd made difficult decisions and gotten comfortable with the weight of them. She took in the scene, the vault, the sword, Marcus standing in the center with the breakfast burrito still on the floor beside the pedestal, and her eyes narrowed with the kind of intensity that made Marcus very aware he'd done something irreversibly wrong. "Technician Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the kind of weight that suggested rank had physical properties. "Perhaps you could explain why my weapons vault is in alarm status." "Gravity fluctuations," Marcus said. He held up the sword slightly as though this explanation would be self-evident. "Regulator was installed wrong. Type 7 instead of a Type 9. I replaced it. Everything's stable now. The work order's complete." Snow walked toward him slowly, deliberately, her webbed fingers flexing at her sides. The dorsal crest that ran along the crown of her head rose slightly, a gesture that Marcus now understood meant something important. This wasn't anger exactly. It was something more complex. Concern, maybe, or recognition. "You are holding the gravity blade," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yeah, I know. I was just checking if the pedestal was damaged underneath. It's fine. Just a light scorch mark, nothing structural." "Higher," Snow interrupted. Marcus looked at her, looked at the sword, looked back at her. There was something in her expression that suggested this wasn't a suggestion. It was something closer to a command, but delivered with a strange quality. Not the hardness of authority, but something that felt more like professional interest. Scientific curiosity. He tossed the sword up about a foot and caught it cleanly, the motion so routine it required almost no conscious thought. Snow's throat sac inflated slightly. "Spin it," she said, "while it's in the air." "Look, I really do have that waste recycler issue on Deck 9, and if I don't get to it soon, the whole section is going to smell like." "Spin it." So he did. Marcus tossed the sword again, gave it a little wrist flick to add rotation. The blade turned once, twice, and he caught it by the handle without dropping it. It was actually not that difficult once you understood the physics. The weight was awkward, sure, but once you understood the axis of rotation, the balance point, the way the mass distributed itself through space relative to the force being applied, it became almost predictable. It was like any other problem in mechanics, complicated until you understood the underlying principles, then elegant in its simplicity. Snow watched him with increasing focus. "Again," she said. "Again," Snow said. He spun it again, and again. Each time it was easier, more intuitive. "Juggle it," Snow said finally. She walked over to a weapons rack on the vault wall and pulled off 2 training batons. They were maybe 2 feet long each, made of some kind of dense polymer that suggested serious engineering. "Use these." Marcus stared at her. "You want me to juggle the gravity blade with training batons?" "Yes." Loxo had backed up against the far wall, his skin cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. Marcus sighed, set the sword aside for a moment and took the batons. They were lighter than he'd expected, maybe 2 pounds each. He tucked the sword under his arm and began the basic cascade pattern. Right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand. Found the rhythm. The muscle memory was old. He'd done this in college, years ago, just for fun during those rare moments when boredom seemed like a luxury he could afford. Then he pulled the sword out and tried to work it into the pattern. The first attempt was sloppy. The sword's weight was different enough that his timing was off, and he had to catch it with his knee and bounce it back up. Loxo made that dying wail sound again, his entire body seeming to convulse with the wrongness of what he was witnessing. "Sorry," Marcus said. "Let me try that again." The second attempt was better. He got maybe 3 full rotations before the sword's balance threw him off, and he had to do an awkward behind-the-back catch to keep it from hitting the floor. It was the kind of save that came from pure instinct, from the body's refusal to allow failure. This is harder than it looks. He concentrated then, really focused. The trick was to throw the sword higher to compensate for the extra time it took to rotate. Once he figured that out, the pattern smoothed out. Right hand baton, left hand baton, right hand sword, left hand baton, right hand baton, left hand sword. The rhythm became almost meditative. Right hand baton, left hand baton, right hand sword. Oh hey, I think I'm getting it. He looked up at Snow, grinning because he'd finally managed a solid rotation pattern, the kind of clean execution that required nothing but focus and timing, and immediately lost his concentration. Both batons went flying. The sword was midair. His hands were full of burrito. When had he grabbed his burrito? He must have picked it up unconsciously, hunger finding its way through the complexity of the moment. The sword was falling. Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He stuck his foot out and caught it on the top of his boot. The flat of the blade landed perfectly balanced there, and he stood motionless, one leg extended, a sword balanced on his boot, holding half a breakfast burrito, while two training batons clattered across the floor like some kind of punctuation mark to the impossible moment he was living. Snow's skin had gone completely pale, almost translucent. He could see the blood vessels underneath pulsing in a way that seemed medically concerning. All three of her eyes were wide enough that he was worried they might actually pop out of her head. Her throat sac was inflated to the size of a cantaloupe and just stayed that way. Not inflating, not deflating. Just frozen, suspended, caught in the moment between one understanding of reality and another. Loxo had slid down the wall into a sitting position, his webbed hands splayed uselessly at his sides, his skin cycling through colors so fast it was basically a strobe light. Red, orange, yellow, blue, green, back to red. The effect was hypnotic and disturbing in equal measure. So, Marcus said, still standing on one leg with a sword on his foot, should I put this down or? Snow's throat sac finally deflated with a sound like a tire losing air. How did you do that? She asked, her voice very quiet, each word seeming to be drawn from somewhere deep inside her. How did you do that? The foot thing, honestly, mostly luck. I used to play hacky sack in college, so I've got pretty good foot-eye coordination. I knew the timing was. Not the foot thing, Snow interrupted. Her voice was steady now, controlled, but there was something underneath it, an urgency that Marcus couldn't quite name. All of it, the holding, the tossing, the juggling, the whatever that was, everything. Hacky sack, Marcus said again, as though repetition might make it make sense. You are treating the most dangerous weapon in Calaxian history like a recreational object, Snow said. And now he could hear something in her voice that he'd never heard directed at him before. It was the tone someone uses when they're trying to understand something that violates every assumption they've ever made about how the universe works. I mean, you're the one who told me to juggle it, Marcus said. I didn't think you could do it, but you told me to, so. Snow's throat sac inflated again. No one can do what you just did, she said. It should be impossible. The gravitational forces alone should have torn your arms from your body. The mass should have crushed every bone in your hand. The stress should have pulverized your skeletal structure, and yet you were balancing it on your foot while eating a sandwich. Burrito, Marcus corrected, then immediately realized that was probably not the point, and that he was avoiding the deeper weight of what she was telling him. He carefully lowered his foot and caught the sword in his free hand. Look, I can hold it out with one hand. If it was really that heavy, my arm would be on the floor right now. It's maybe 20 pounds tops. Awkward distribution, sure, but I can manage it. It masses 400,000 kells. Marcus blinked. 400,000 kells. That was. He tried to do the conversion in his head. That was more than a small transport vehicle. That was the kind of weight that should require industrial equipment to move. That should require anti-gravity sleds and careful orchestration. That should be impossible for any biological being to lift. And yet he was holding it in one hand. Okay, well, Your scale's definitely broken, Marcus said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Because I can hold it out like this. If this thing really weighed 400,000 anything, I'd be crushed. I'd be paste. So someone must have made a mistake when they weighed it, or the measurement system is corrupted. Snow walked closer. Her 3 eyes studied him with an intensity that made his skin feel tight. "What is your physical history?" she asked. "Have you undergone any genetic modifications, any military enhancements, any gravitational field augmentation?" "What? No, I'm a maintenance tech. I fix things, that's it." "Loxo," Snow said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of something Marcus couldn't identify. "Scan him." Loxo, still sitting against the wall and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, pulled out a handheld scanner with shaking fingers. He pointed it at Marcus, stared at the readout. His 3 eyes blinked in sequence, left, right, top, looked at Marcus, looked at the scanner, back to Marcus. "Commander," he said faintly, his voice carrying the weight of information that nobody wanted to receive. He is completely baseline." "Baseline what?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Baseline human," Loxo said. "No genetic modifications, no cybernetic enhancements, no gravitational field manipulation technology, no localized reality anchors, no augmentation of any kind that our scanners can detect. He is just a human, completely ordinary, completely unmodified." Marcus wanted to laugh, but he didn't. The moment for that had passed. "Yeah, I could have told you that. I filled out the medical forms when I got hired. Everything standard human baseline. No enhancements, nothing special." Snow walked over to the sword stand and sat down on it. Just sat right down, like her legs had stopped working. Like the act of standing had become too complicated to maintain. Her skin was still that concerning translucent pale color, and Marcus could see her breathing becoming more deliberate, more controlled, as though she was running through some kind of internal diagnostic. "This is a problem," she said quietly. "Is it though?" Marcus took another bite of burrito. The food was cold now, but he ate it anyway, needing something ordinary to hold on to. "I mean, I fixed the gravity fluctuations. The work order's complete. Everything's stable now. Everyone's happy." "Everyone is not happy." Snow looked up at him with all 3 eyes. "Do you understand what this means? If humans can casually wield weapons that our strongest warriors cannot even lift, that changes everything. The power balance of the entire sector, our defensive strategies, our understanding of human biology. She stopped herself, as though recognizing she was spiraling into territory she wasn't ready to explore yet. "Everything." Marcus shrugged, still holding the sword, still not quite understanding the magnitude of what he'd done or what it meant. "Counterpoint, I really don't think I'm special. I'm just a maintenance guy. Pretty sure any human could do this if they tried. I mean, I'm in okay shape, but nothing crazy. Definitely not the strongest person on this station." The color drained from both Calaxians simultaneously. It was like watching the life drain out of something, the vitality retreating, leaving only shock in its place. "Any human," Snow repeated, and her voice had gotten very quiet indeed. "Yeah, I mean, there's this guy in engineering. Marcus 2, we call him. He's way stronger than me. He probably could throw this thing across the room if he wanted to. I'm just reasonably coordinated. That's all this is. Coordination and focus." Laxo made a sound like a dying whale, a long, mournful cry that echoed off the vault walls. Snow put her face in her webbed hands. "I need to file a report with Fleet Command," she said, her words coming through her fingers, muffled but still audible. "About gravity blade containment protocol failures, about humans being terrifying, about the possibility that an entire species we've spent decades negotiating with is casually more powerful than our military installations." She looked up. "You are dismissed, Technician Hayes. Do not touch the gravity blade again. In fact, do not touch any weapons in the vault. Just do your maintenance work and try not to accidentally demonstrate any more horrifying abilities." "I really don't think." "Dismissed," Snow said, and the finality in that single word was absolute. Marcus shrugged, set the sword back on its stand, and headed for the door. Behind him, he heard Loxo asking if they had any sedatives strong enough for Calaxian physiology, and Snow responding with something that sounded like dark humor. The alarms had stopped. The vault was secure. The problem had been solved. As he stepped into the corridor, his data pad pinged. New message from station operations. Written reprimand for unauthorized gravity weapon manipulation during designated lunch periods. He laughed so hard he almost dropped his burrito. But as he walked back toward the maintenance wing, still holding the half-eaten breakfast wrap, still moving through corridors that looked exactly as they had when he'd entered them, something shifted in his awareness. His casual competence, the thing he'd always relied on to make him invisible, forgettable, safely ordinary, had just become something dangerous. He could feel it in the way the station seemed different around him now, or maybe it was just that he was different. The invisible man had done something visible, and the universe had noticed. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus tried not to think about what had happened. He tried to return to the comfortable rhythm of being overlooked, invisible, safely ordinary. But the incident had left a mark on the station's consciousness that wouldn't fade, and by extension on his own. Work orders kept coming. Power distribution on Deck 12, atmospheric recyclers on Deck 3, a communications relay that kept failing in Sector 7. He did his job exactly as he'd always done it, moving through the station with the same careful competence. But now people noticed him in ways they hadn't before. Crew members would go quiet when he entered a room. Conversations would pause, resume when he passed. There was a new weight to the attention he received. Not the comfortable weight of recognition, but something heavier. Something that felt like fear mixed with awe, two emotions that didn't belong in the same space. Loxo didn't avoid him, but their interactions had become stilted. The Calaxian would nod when they passed in the corridors, a gesture that felt formal, distant, carefully calibrated to maintain professional distance. Marcus wondered what was happening in his friend's mind, what machinery of internal conflict he was processing. Loxo had been a witness to something that violated the fundamental laws of physics as his species understood them. That left a mark too, the kind of mark that changed how you looked at the universe. Snow was harder to read. She didn't acknowledge his existence at all during those 3 weeks, though he caught her watching him once in the cafeteria, all 3 eyes following his movements with clinical precision before she turned away. There was something in that observation that suggested calculation, evaluation, the careful assembly of data that would build toward some larger purpose. She was constructing something, building a case, preparing for something that would come next. The gravity blade incident had become one of those strange stories that people talked about once and then stopped discussing where Marcus could hear them. But the silence around it was significant. It suggested that somewhere up the chain of command, in the offices of people he'd never met and probably never would, decisions were being made about what his impossible strength meant for the political and military balance of the known galaxy. Marcus went home each night to his small quarters and stared at the holo display cycling through nature scenes from Earth, forests he'd never walked through, oceans he'd never swum in, mountains he'd never climbed. He lay in his bunk and thought about the sword, about the moment when he'd caught it on his boot, about the instant when his life had divided into before and after. He thought about the fact that he'd been 34 years old and had never known he was capable of anything extraordinary. In the darkness of his quarters, with nothing but the soft hum of life support systems and the distant sounds of the station turning around him, Marcus understood something that scared him more than anything else could have. He'd spent his entire life believing he was ordinary. It had been a comfortable belief. Safe. Limiting, perhaps, but safe. No one expected anything from you when you were ordinary. No one asked you to be anything more than you were. But now that belief was gone, burned away like morning fog by the light of a simple fact he could no longer deny. He was not ordinary. He had never been ordinary. He just never had any reason to discover what he was actually capable of. This knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and permanent. It changed the way he moved through the station. It changed the way he looked at his own hands. It changed everything about how he understood himself and his place in the cosmos. If a maintenance technician could hold a legendary weapon that weighed as much as a spacecraft, what else might be possible? What other capabilities had humanity been hiding, not deliberately but through simple ignorance? What else was waiting to be discovered in the baseline genome of his species? These questions haunted him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The truth was slower in coming than he expected. It arrived on a data pad message at 200 hours, an official notice forwarded through the station commander. A summary of the Calaxian fleet's internal investigations. Their scientists had run the numbers dozens of times and couldn't explain the anomaly. The gravitational field around the blade should have been lethal to any unmodified human. Period. There was no scenario in their models where a baseline human should be capable of even holding such an object, let alone manipulating it with such casual grace. But Marcus had held it as though it weighed no more than any ordinary object. He'd tossed it like a child's toy. He'd balanced it on his foot while eating breakfast. The only explanation that fit the data was that humans, baseline unaugmented humans, possessed some kind of inherent gravitational resistance that the Calaxians, the Krell, and every other spacefaring species in known space didn't have. It wasn't learned, wasn't augmented, wasn't something that could be trained into them. It was biological, genetic, written into the very code of what it meant to be human at the molecular level. Something that should have been obvious but hadn't been until a maintenance technician had casually picked up a legendary weapon and tossed it like a toy. Marcus read the report twice and set his data pad aside. He thought about his hands, about the warmth of the sword's hilt, about the moment when he'd caught it on his boot and felt, for just an instant, something like purpose, not the purpose of his job, but something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with work orders and gravity regulators and the comfortable invisibility of being someone nobody remembered. The quarters were spacious, appointed with the kind of understated luxury that came with rank. Floor-to-ceiling viewport looking out toward the distant stars, the kind of view that most crew members never got to see, the raw infinity of space, unmediated by glass or station architecture. It was the kind of view that made a person small, or at least forced them to acknowledge their smallness in the face of something vast and incomprehensible. Snow was standing by that viewport when Marcus entered, her skin a calm blue-gray, as though she'd spent the time between their last meeting achieving some kind of internal equilibrium. When she heard him enter, she turned. "I've been authorized to make you an offer," she said without preamble, without any of the social niceties that usually preceded such conversations. Fleet Command has decided that what happened in Vault 7 is too significant to leave as an anomaly. We need to understand human physiology better. We need to understand the mechanism behind your species' gravitational resistance. "I'm a maintenance tech," Marcus said, "not a scientist." "No," Snow agreed. "You're not, but you have something we need. The ability to interact with technologies that should be lethal to your biology. And more importantly, you've demonstrated an instinctive understanding of how to handle force and mass in ways that suggest something deeper than mere luck. That suggests capability, real, measurable power." She moved closer, and Marcus felt the weight of her attention. All three eyes focused on him with the intensity of a scientist studying something unexpected under a microscope. "For 7 years," Snow continued, "you've maintained the systems of this station. You've been invisible, competent but unremarkable. And then you walked into Vault 7, and in the space of 30 minutes, you forced us to rewrite every assumption we've ever made about human beings. Do you understand what that means?" Marcus shook his head. He didn't understand. Not really. Not in any way that felt manageable. "It means," Snow said, that your species is far more dangerous than we ever imagined. It means that the balance of power in this sector, in this entire region of space, has fundamentally shifted. It means that humanity has been hiding something, maybe from us, maybe from yourselves, and that something has profound implications. I don't think I'm hiding anything, Marcus said. I'm just a guy who can hold heavy things. You're not, Snow said quietly. What happened in that vault was not a fluke. It was not luck. You caught a sword that weighs as much as a transport shuttle using the reflexes of someone who played hacky sack in college. You balanced it on your foot while eating breakfast. You juggled it with training batons. These things should not be possible, and yet they were, because you are human, because your species is built with some capacity that ours isn't. She turned back toward the viewport, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Your people have been negotiating with us as though they were the inferior party, asking for access to our technologies, requesting trade agreements, behaving as though they need us to survive in this galaxy. But what if that's been the entire dynamic working backward? What if humanity has been pretending to be weaker than you actually are? Marcus thought about this, about the possibility that his entire species had been engaged in some kind of subtle deception. It seemed unlikely. Humans were many things, but subtle wasn't usually one of them. I want you to work with our scientists, Snow said, turning back to face him. Let us study your physiology. Let us understand how human biology interacts with gravitational fields. Let us find others like you and understand whether this is something all humans share or something unique to you specifically. Help us understand what your species is truly capable of. He could have said no, should have said no. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to decline, to return to his work orders and his breakfast burritos and the comfortable obscurity of a maintenance tech whose name nobody remembered. It would have been the safe choice, the intelligent choice, the choice that allowed him to remain invisible. But he'd held the gravity blade, and it had changed something fundamental in him. The invisible man had caught something impossible, and the universe had noticed. The weight of that moment, that perfect balance, had shifted something inside him that couldn't be shifted back. Okay, Marcus said, I'll do it. Snow's 3 eyes reflected the starlight from the viewport, bright points of light in an otherwise dark face. Good, she said. We'll begin tomorrow. There's so much we need to understand. So much we need to learn about you, about your species, about what this means for all of us going forward. She paused, looking back toward the viewport, toward the infinity of space and all the questions it represented. The galaxy just became a very different place, Technician Hayes. You just made it a very different place. I hope you understand that. Marcus wasn't sure he did, but he was beginning to. As he left her quarters, walking back through the corridors of the station toward his small, ordinary quarters, Marcus realized something important. The real weight he'd been carrying wasn't the sword at all. It was the burden of his own invisibility, of the things he'd convinced himself he couldn't do because nobody had ever asked him to try. It was the weight of being overlooked, unremarkable, forgotten. He'd been a maintenance tech, keeping the station running, unnoticed and unmissed. But tonight, he was something else. He was someone who'd held the impossible and found that it was lighter than he'd been taught to believe. Someone who'd discovered that his limitations were mostly imaginary, constructed from years of living down to other people's low expectations of him. The gravity blade was behind reinforced walls now, locked away in its vault. But the thing it had revealed, the truth it had carried in its weight, that would shape everything that came after. It had revealed that Marcus Hayes was not ordinary. It had revealed that humans were not weak. It had revealed that the entire structure of the galactic order had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding. Marcus walked through the corridors of the station with different eyes. The work orders would keep coming. The systems would need maintaining. But he was no longer the invisible man keeping them running in the dark. He was the human who'd caught the gravity blade on a Tuesday afternoon, The maintenance tech who'd handled the legendary weapon of an alien species as though it were a toy. The person who'd stood in the vault and, without meaning to, changed the world. And somewhere in the weight of that realization, in the balance between the person he'd been and the person he was becoming, Marcus Hayes found something that felt a lot like meaning. It was heavier than any sword. It was also, he was learning, worth the burden. This was the beginning of something he couldn't yet name, a future written in the space between what he'd thought was possible and what he'd just proven to be true. A path that would lead him from invisibility into something larger, something that would ultimately change not just his life, but the understanding of his entire species across the galaxy. He was no longer invisible. And that, above all else, changed everything.